And I guess being a little bit of a process history nut was a way to go into that, or kind of the reason behind that. So, who am I? My name is Rob Shaw. I am the Agile practice lead here at Clearly Agile. I'm also work day to day as an enterprise Agile coach, working with organizations doing adoption and transformation, as well as scaling initiatives with Scrum at Scale and SAFe. I've been in the software industry for the past 25 plus years now, starting to lose track a little bit, with just about 20 of those being specialized in Agile coaching and building Agile teams. So my contact information is up there. As always, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn, or let's connect up in some other way, and but have conversations, and always looking to engage with people and kind of build a sense of community around all of this. Right. So a quick outline for what we're going to talk about today. Right. May ebb and flow a little bit from this, but kind of the top line bullet points. Right. So when we talk about frameworks and choosing one or the other, what are the real factors that go into making that decision? Right. And we're going to talk about the Agile connection behind all of it, right? So all of the frameworks that we're going to talk about are Agile frameworks, and to understand how they're used, need to understand a little bit about where they came from. We're going to go into a kind of a unique angle on this, which is looking at the personalities of the frameworks and what makes them different based on where they came from and how that may benefit you and what you're trying to do in your organization. And then we're going to talk very briefly about scaling at the end, just a small segment. If there's more interest on the scaling side, it can absolutely target another webinar that focuses specifically on the scaling frameworks and doing a similar comparison of those. Right. So, I see the question jumped up already. Okay, that's from Ashley. Oh, do you hold the series every month? So that was a question that just came up. Yes, we do. Usually the third or fourth Friday every month. If you head to our website, there's a place to register and sign up, so you'll get notifications on it. Or if you follow us on like LinkedIn or social media, we're also posting when we do those types of events. All right. So if we're going to talk about frameworks, right, we sort of need to go back to a little bit of the beginning. Now, this is not a class or a refresher on, what is Agile and the manifesto and the principles, but we do need to talk a little bit about it, right? See, in today, in 2023, right, there's a lot of folks that kind of just go under the assumption that Agile equals Scrum, right? That there's a single choice, or that Scrum automatically equals Agile, right? And really, that's not the case, right? In the late 1990s and the early 2000s, there were a whole lot of thought leaders that were experimenting with these new and different ways of building software better, because there were a lot of struggles in the way things were being built then, right? There was very much an industry manufacturing mindset to how we manage products, projects, and people. And those thought leaders were really out on the cutting edge, going, no, this is wrong. This isn't how software is built, right? We're failing. And starting to play around with different ways to rethink the situation. Right. So what that kind of brought us to was this point in time in 2001, where they, 17 of them got together in Utah. And they coined, right, they thought they were going to come together and figure out just one process that they could all agree on, right? So what is the new process going forward? And they couldn't do that, right? They tried, and they realized that they all had these different situations, and they couldn't come up with this one process that fit them all. What they came up with was a series of mindset and principles that they at least could all agree on, of like, yeah, this is what we're trying to capture in each of our frameworks, in each of our activities, right? And that further got expanded into the principles, right? And those principles were this shared understanding that described the culture, the way of working, what they wanted to focus on, that was living in each of these ideas that each of them were running with and throwing out into the industry, right? So they were all these common behaviors that they all shared or aspired in some way to encapsulate into the way they were working, what they were teaching, and what they were experimenting with, right? And that's where we kind of see the awesomeness and the confusion come from the agile community today, right? You had a mindset described by 4 values that had the 12 principles, and then this explosion of practices, frameworks, facilitation techniques, programming technology techniques, right? This just explosion that's still going today. And really, the way I like to look at this is that's a good thing, right? What that gives us is choice, right? So out of the practices, whether it's Scrum, Kanban, XP, Crystal, DHCP, Prince2, if we start getting into scaling with like Nexus, Less, Scrum at Scale, Discipline Agile Development, right? This means that we have the opportunity to look at what we're doing in our organization, what the team is doing, what are they working on, and maybe have some choice in applying what is maybe a better framework, or what they can experiment with to actually do better, right? To get the job done better, right? Because that's really what we're looking at the end of the day is what's the best way to deliver this value, right? So while Scrum, hands down is the most popular framework, depending on the work and the environment, there may be alternatives, right? Now, today we're going to focus on 3, right? And Scrum is one of them. But we're kind of focus on the big 3, or at least the big 3 ones here in the US, right? As we go through this, right? So when I first started thinking about this, right, my mind went to, oh, yep, this is a decision tree, right? We're going to build a decision tree, easy peasy, and we're done. And as I started down that route back in early April, that first week of April, I was very quickly reminded that because of those shared roots of Agile, that most of the frameworks we're going to talk about, technically can be applied in most situations. And the decision tree was not that simple, right? I started running the, if yes, then this, if no, then this. And after I kind of got through that first cut, there was like, well, then there's a maybe, right? So these started to have, if yes, do this, if no, do this, if maybe, then do, one of 6 different other things. Right. So I started rethinking how I wanted to share this. I wanted to take a little bit of a different angle, and maybe twist the perspective a little bit to something that may stick or take away a way that may stick a little bit differently, that might be a little bit easier to do a comparison with. So kind of a first cut running this thought model, or sharing this thought model with you today. All right. So at the top, right? We really want to look at like what are the factors that really influence whether one framework will fit or work better in an environment than others, right? And wanted to kind of get an initial common set across all of them, right? So let's talk about the highest level first. All right. At the highest level, there are really 3 main categories of influence and drivers that we want to look at, right? And that is the organization culture, right? So what is the nature of the organization that we're working in? Is it structured, or are we more entrepreneurial, right? Are we a planning organization, or are we a run with scissors organization? Do we focus on planning, right? Do we like that structure? Does the organization have a heartbeat that they come together and plan together frequently, and there's good alignment and communication, right? Or is the organization a little more fluid in how it approaches things? And the last one at that top, right, that last category I started thinking it is at the organization or culture level. Is the organization itself a high trust or low trust environment? Right. Right. Do we empower people and trust them to get the job done? Or has the organization had a different experience and is a little more cautious in how trust is awarded or given? Right. And really, that is one of the factors that we need to look at. One, just going into Agile, and two, with what type of Agile framework we're using. Right. If we look at team culture, right? So we have organizational culture at the top, team culture over here on the right. When we look at our teams, right? Do we have what level of ownership do we have with the teams, right? Do we have high ownership teams that really see themselves deeply embedded in the organization and the mission, and right, they're laser focused on getting the job done? Or do we have a varying degree away from that, where maybe not as deeply embedded, or transient through an organization, right? That is something that's not as deeply embedded. That's going to influence it. What is the team's ability to self-organize, right? Is the team, one, empowered to do that? And two, are they comfortable doing that, right? In today's day and age, if there are some folks that have had experience in really empowering Agile organizations, but for the majority of folks, even working in Agile organizations, that's not the case, right? Technical excellence, right? So where on the scale of engineer to coder is the majority of the teams, and not necessarily where they are today, but where do we want or need them to be based on the product and solutions that we're working on, right? And how does that influence team culture, right? And then at the end of the day, what is their willingness to step outside the box and experiment, right? Is it a team that needs structure and a safety net, and likes having at least a pattern that they can follow? Or is it a team that's very comfortable, working without a net on a tightrope, and is willing to skirt the edges and play around with it, right? When we look at the frameworks, that's one of the big indicators on there is, the amount of structure and guidance that's naturally in place for it, right? And then, the other big influencer in here is, like, we're going to look at things that are in the nature of the work, right? Is the work planned, right? Is there a goal? Is there a target? Is there a milestone? Is there something that we're looking to do with it? Or is the nature of the work that the team is working on very emergent, right? Where it's changing very fluidly, week over week, month over month, quarter over quarter, even day to day for some teams, right? And it's never absolutes on that, but where on that spectrum are they, right? The frameworks approach that differently, and some shine and some struggle with this. Stability of priorities, right? Same thing as planned versus emergent, right? But the more stable the priorities, the better we are with structured. The less stable, the more we want to look at fluidity and flow. Product types, project types, right? Time expectations, all things that kind of factor into it, right? So, this was kind of eye-opening going down that thought, because I started thinking back to that first, Agile conversation, right? And it sort of tied in a little bit, right? So, when we talk about Scrum, XP, Kanban, or any of the other frameworks, right, they all have a signature personality, right? In other words, a reflection of the inventor, creator, or creators, how they thought, and more importantly, what were the challenges they were facing when they were creating or building this. We see still reflected in those frameworks today, right? Each of those frameworks was born to solve problems, right? The problems that they were facing back in the time frame when they coined them or put them on paper, right? The people that invented them, they did not learn the frameworks, right? They didn't go to Scrum training or Kanban training, right? They were writing them, right? It was trial by fire. They were live working with clients and figuring this out, solving problems as they were doing this, and experimenting it with each client that they worked on, right? Just kind of give an example, XP, Extreme Programming, right? Ken Beck, when he was leading this, right, he was handed the reins of a multi-year failing initiative at Chrysler. And he was the voice in the wilderness saying, no, we need to scrap it, start over. This is wrong. And finally, one day Chrysler came to him and said, look, you seem to know what you're doing. We don't want you just to work on leading our coding team. We want you to run the project. He was willing to throw out years of bad code, years of bad practice. And then they're like, what are you going to do? He's like, well, and on the fly, he started coming up with the foundations of extreme programming, if this is what we're going to do. Right. So what's interesting is we still see that today when we look at it. Right. We look at Kanban. Right. It's older than Agile. Right. It goes back to Toyota production system, and even to a degree before that. But it's the work of Tom and Mary Poppendieck and later Henrik Nyberg, where they saw the flexibility and the benefits of having a flexible flow-based model that could work to continually generate a stream of value, right? And we see that as that's adopted in the software, right? So the situations that built them is really what's going to tell us what the competitive edge or advantage of one framework is over the other. In other words, right, what were they born to handle? And what does that look like, right? So kind of a cool thought process to go down, right? For each of them, right, I took a stab at, if I had to score these, right, on a scale of 1 to 10, what dimensions would I look at, right? And we'll talk about these. There's probably others if I were to rethink this or keep expanding on it. But these are the ones that initially came to mind, right? What's the level of team ownership that's expected by the framework, right? And does that match what your teams are looking for? The level of technical mastery that's implied. Predictability and planning, emergent work, how does it do with vague initiatives, right? Is it easy to learn? Is it easy to master? And is there any specific roles required outside of the norm, right, that you would have to factor into your organization, right? Kind of use this as a scoring backdrop, and we'll kind of do a comparison here at the end of as we start building on this. All right. So grab a quick drink here, and then we will jump in. All right, so we're going to jump in with an early front runner of Agile, XP Extreme Programming. I actually love XP and Extreme Programming. When Agile really first taking hold, XP was the early front runner. A lot of organizations were jumping on the extreme programming bandwagon. They were leaning and playing around with this in organizations. And for good reason. It's actually a very solid framework. All right, so it was originally formulated by Kent Beck in the late 90s, and it was built on the need for having a lightweight but technically focused approach to fix a major project at Chrysler, right? So Kent was a programming guru. If you think of like where did unit tests come from, it was Kent. Right, the concept of it, test-driven development, the early foundations of clean code all come out of this school of thinking, right? So he was very heavy on the technical side of being technically excellent and having that in his programming community. So when it came to a framework, he wanted just enough to hold structure, right? So we could focus on the other side, right? So kind of the minimalist version from a structure side. But on the opposite, very rigid from a technical excellence side, right? So it was born when he took his popular TDD, test-driven development approach, and then added some common sense planning activities to simplify the chaos that was going on around them, right? So while XP is a planning framework in its own right, what we saw with this is many teams not running XP have actually started adopting the principles and techniques from XP into other frameworks. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the early versions of Scrum were very much extended by the work that XP did before it. They looked very, very similar, in those early days, right? And you saw the pairing of Scrum XP coming out very, very strong in the early 2000s, right? So while some of the other ones we'll look at are a little more process oriented, XP's focus has always remained the same, right? Their primary goal in XP is to build the right thing in the right way, right? So time was not as much a factor with XP. It was more focused on understanding and making sure that we're building the thing right in the right way and getting the right result to the customer. So time was one of those things that would flex in those early models of XP, right? So if we take a look at it, right, right, you see that up there, right? XP in a nutshell, right? It was build it right over build it fast, right? The focus was not to get it out quickly. The focus was to get it out correctly in the shortest amount of time, but it is what it is. It took what it took. From an XP perspective, similar to Scrum, is that, the work would have a backlog and that work would get split out over many smaller iterations, typically 2 or 3 weeks. And if you look at the circle of the graphics up there, right, from a culture perspective, extreme programming is a very, very development centric culture at its core, and very, very centered around development techniques, right? Pair programming, refactors, simple design, test driven development, sustainability, right? It very much using development focused language and development focused activities. This is also where we see a lot of concepts you may have played around with, right? Pair programming, the concept of getting fast feedback, the concept of refactoring often. We still see this happening in teams using other frameworks. So a lot of very influential. From a planning perspective, XP really has 3 main events or planning activities in there. And that top one is optional, right? That actually came in later. It was not in the initial version, right? So from a planning perspective, extreme programming runs an iteration plan every 1 to 3 weeks, right? So this is the one thing, the one most important thing we need to get done over these 1 to 3 weeks. And then XP runs a daily stand-up, right? So if you've ever run an agile stand-up where you have the 3 questions, this is where it came from. It was adopted in the early version, which was really, when it came from XP, a very development-focused activity, right? As far as, required roles, again, XP is pretty lightweight, right? We have the customer, right? So the customers are expected to be heavily engaged in the development process by creating or co-creating user stories. They're there to provide continuous feedback, as well as the onus of making necessary business decisions related to the product, right? So it's not necessarily a specialty role like we see in other frameworks like a product owner. The idea there was, right, in XP is we cohabitate in our planning space, in our workspace, and the customer is part of our team as we go through this. Right now, that may ebb and flow, right? But an XP team works directly for the customer, directly for the stakeholder. It implies an involvement, and that has some working advantages in certain type of projects. In some of those get her done type of situations or SWAT team type of situations where you have that access. Extreme programming shines. It is a strength there. Also on there, we have the programmer developer, right? So on an XP team, right, these are the team members that actually produce product, right? They're responsible for implementing the user stories, conducting the user tests. Since from an XP standpoint, we're usually also associating a cross-functional. We make sure that we have development and testing and business skills all on the team, right? Now, XP is kind of unique because it doesn't necessarily specify the difference between a developer and a tester. From that perspective, it looks at testing code as a shared everybody activity. Like everybody tests, we learn, we're cross-functional, right? Whether we're writing it in code or validating it afterwards. As a team member on XP, everybody does this and everybody delivers this at the end. We share responsibility to do that, right? So it was a very, 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 you are a software professional. This is your job point of stance on it, right? XP probably takes the hardest line on that out of all the other frameworks. They come out of the gate with that as a necessity for forming an extreme programming team, right? There are also optional roles, right? Now, right, we have the trackers and managers, right? It's not required, right? It can also be performed by one of the developers, or a lot of times we'd even see this rotate. But as this goes through there, right, these are the people that organize the meetups, they regulate the discussions, they keep track of important progress. They're there to look at metrics. Right now, I have seen this in organizations where, you know, there is a tracker that works with XP teams and they help facilitate and take that workload off the team. I have also worked in organizations where, right, that team, the team members just rotate. It's their turn this week, this iteration to take the role, and they all share that responsibility. Coaches, right? Now, coaching, right, from an agile coach perspective, aren't necessarily included in the team. They're usually some sort of outside assistant that may embed with a team for a period of time, right? So either an assistant or an external coach, right? They're not directly involved in the development process, but they're there to look at how the team is running XP and to be a reflective observer to help the team grow and get better, to see what the team cannot see themselves today, right? To help them improve, if they're learning it, to learn it, if they're used to doing it, how to improve or even help avoid mistakes, right? You know, Extreme Program doesn't necessarily have a reflection or adaptation or a retrospective the way some of the other frameworks do. So this was one of the ways that they just kind of build in ongoing improvement, right? Kind of getting some periodic coach or outside influence feedback on how they were doing. And I thought this was neat, right? Doomsayer is worth calling out. This really isn't a specific person, but anybody, any team member internally or externally on an extreme program team can pull the Doomsayer card. Right? Anyone at any given point in time can point out that the sky is falling and things are going wrong, right? It's kind of worn as a badge of honor that you were the doomsayer and you saved the project, right? That's kind of the intent that it's looking for, right? But you know, some teams actually even have a little bit of fun with that. You know, I've seen doomsayer hats, right? I've had people that had the doomsayer staff, where somebody could pick it up in the team meeting at any given point in time and give a prophecy. You know, they have fun with it, right? But the idea behind this was to create a kind of a kitschy, kind of fun development culture way that anybody can raise the flag at any given point in time and call foul, right? They can stop the assembly line and say things are going wrong, right? And it's given credence, right? So it's not abused, right? It's used when appropriate. And then the team figures out, like, you know, they do an evaluation. Is it real? Is it not real? Is there something we can do to correct it? So kind of a cool, quirky thing that lives in XP. If you've got a team that likes, you know, playing around with like just fun, quirky concepts, it's kind of a neat fit. As far as the events, right? The events also in XP are fairly lightweight. In fact, I think they struggled even putting this up in a graphic at one point in time. It really probably is the lightest structure from a planning perspective. Quarterly, or most commonly quarterly, they will do some version of release planning, right? Where what we have here is a review of the create user stories around the targets that we want to hit, right? So for this quarter, for this release, what are the most important things that our customer needs us to solve? We're going to review any existing user stories, or we are going to create user stories that help us solve that, right? Out of that, they know it's not going to all fit, right? So that gets narrowed down to what they call the likely target group, right? So out of all the world of possibilities, based on what they know a little bit from capacity, this is the batch that is the likely target. And then one of the things that's unique within XP is now that they have that in the targets, one of the last things they do is what are the epics and spikes that are needed, right? So in other words, are there any larger or exploratory work that we need to build as part of solving this? Let's put this on the table during planning, right? The release planning is really there kind of just to go from the many down to the one or few targets that they want to make sure that they get done during that segment. Iteration planning, right? And what's interesting about their iteration planning or the planning game, as they call it, is we still see the echoes of this in Scrum today. These events in the early days were very, very, very parallel, right? I think Scrum borrowed the planning game when they were coming up with that. Typically, an iteration, right, is a fixed duration and usually between 1 and 3 weeks. 3 weeks was the most common one when they started, but it's gotten shorter over time. In the start of iteration planning, right, it is selecting the next most important story. Right now, that's interesting. It has become stories over time, right? But initially, it was the next most important story, right? What is the 1 or 2 things that we need to get done over this 1 to 3 week time frame, right? In XP, they do a very detailed capacity planning, right? Where they look at the team members, the availability, who's in, who's out, who's on vacation, who plans on getting sick. Are there any holidays coming up? And they actually get into a very detailed breakdown of availability and hours. That was a hallmark of the early version of the planning game, right? So this is one of those places where the planning really tries to dial it in from a developer standpoint, right? 5 people, 8 hours a day, that's 40 hours a day times 5 working days, right? We have 200 hours in a week, but we have 10 hours out, right? Or for this 1 week, right, we have 180 hours to work on, right? And so then what they do is they take the user stories and they will detail out the work, right, at that time of commitment, right? So whatever is in the user story, the acceptance criteria, very similar to if you've done Scrum, this is where it came from, right? This is where they task out the work. This is where they build the solution. So they would go into, we're updating this stored procedure, we're updating this method, this function, we're refactoring this. These are the tests we're going to run. It was a very detailed and specific activity. In other words, this is the work. This is how we're going to solve it, and these are the people that are going to solve it. And they would provide hours estimates for that. Right. And at the end of planning, the hours of the detailed work had to be the same or less than the capacity that they had planned. Right. This is how they kind of dialed in and got really good at what they could complete in an iteration. Is they played this game with a high degree of seriousness and responsibility and shared ownership of this is how we plan. Right. It became known as the planning game. Right. So that's probably the heaviest event that they have in there from a planning standpoint. Right. And then from an XP standpoint, right, they would run a daily stand-up, right? And the original version of the daily stand-up, while it was all developers on the team, right? So there was no manager, there was no scrum master. This was run by the developers every day as a way to look at the progress, to identify impediments, as well as to collect like pairing assignments, or if anybody needed to meet up. Right. So it started out very much with the 3-question format most of us associate when we hear the word stand up. Right. What did you do yesterday to progress forward towards our goal? What are your plans to do today? Is there anything standing in your way? Right. Again, the key difference there, it was by developers, for the benefit of developers. Right. It was not a leadership or management or status event. They really focused it around, right, did we make progress? What are you stuck on? Who do we need to pair with today? Right, or what are the pairing assignments for today? Right, right. So you see that broken down in a little more detail, but that's kind of the highlights, right? From a structure, it is fairly lightweight, right? So then we start looking at like what are the success factors, right? What makes this work over some of the other frameworks, right? So one, right, it needs highly invested team members. It is hard to do XP with team members whose hearts aren't in it. right? So this is where we often see, that commando team or that SWAT team type of mentality come into play, right? If you have folks that are congregated in that high performing, high commitment, highly entrepreneurial, high ownership mindset, right, where they are like all in and they can work as a unit or a squad with a high trust environment. Extreme programming might be a framework to consider using with them, right? But here's the other factor with it, right? Is extreme programming only works, right? And I use that word only with with the sincerity it involves, if that team also has a high degree of technical discipline, right? It was born out of test-driven development. Test-driven development came first. So there is a lot of expectation for extreme programming, right? Developers own quality, period. Nobody else does. Developers own quality, period. From a TDD perspective, when it's in XP, right? Everything that we do, we're going to write the test first to fail before we write a line of code. In other words, all right, we're going to break it down into small chunks. And before a line of code is written, we're going to talk about what are the tests it needs to pass at the end. And then we're going to write the code, right? So it kind of follows that pattern that's over on the right, right? Write the failing test, write code to make the test pass, and then refactor the code, right? And then repeat and repeat, right? So testing and testing mindset from a developer at that unit level is kind of a cornerstone, and it really works inside of extreme programming, right? I'm not saying that as a negative. It's actually a really awesome practice to see it when it's successful. It is a quality focus mindset, right? So everything from XP, at the end of every iteration and cycle, the goal of a team running extreme programming, whatever they've done, is to bring the software always back to a working state, right? That is the mantra of the team moving forward. We're done with this iteration. Do we have working software? We're done with the next iteration. Do we have working software, right? It is always front and center on a team, right? So now that we kind of get down into those bottom ones, you could see where that highly entrepreneurial, high trust, highly technical aspect comes in, right? We want that. Right. And then really at the end of the day, it is a framework where you need that customer involvement. Right. There is not a product owner. Their idea from an extreme programming factor is go right to the source, right? Either the stakeholders or the customer, and we're going to stick them in the same room. And we want technology and business to have the friction of rubbing up each other, right? We're going to learn how to have the conversations. It's going to be fast paced, right? We need real time decisions, right? And it did not delegate the role. It just said, nope, y'all were in the room together, right? And you all are now responsible for delivering this, right? All right. So I did see a question go up. Where does BDD fit in? Ooh, interesting. So BDD was a later extension, so behavior driven development. It can still fit in, right? It's a choice, right? They don't specify it. But BDD would apply in an extreme programming environment. You could utilize BDD in Scrum. If you had a Kanban team that was working on feature development, you could use BDD. So really BDD, the idea or concept that you should automate the acceptance criteria and maintain a library over time in a common language that is also reusable. Utilizable and all, right? TDD is just very specific to extreme programming. So good question. Thank you for asking it. Right. So if we go to our first scoring chart, right? So kind of where does this fall? Right now, granted, this is my opinion, right? So if you have a different one, that's fine, right? This is just kind of what I used to kind of mark this out. Right. Specific roles, it's low. It's like a 2.5. I'd even probably put it a little bit lower, right? You need developers, you need a customer. Right, that's really there, right? There's not a whole lot of specialty. Easy to master. Ooh, it's probably middle of the road. And the reason why I put easy to master lower is if you look at the offset score for easy to learn, right? XP, the hardest part about doing XP is learning the foundations of the technical excellence involved in it. That cost is upfront if you're not already doing it today. Right. So I kind of, when I was looking at this, I'm like, is it easy to master? No, you've got to learn TDD and you got to learn how to apply it and you got to get really good there. And I was like, hold on, no, that's all up front, right? So I kind of shifted it down into down a little bit. Um, uh, uh, Handles vague initiatives. This is what XP was built for. XP extreme programming excels when you have a small team working, one or two small teams working with the customer, and the customer's like, I've got an idea. And it's like, okay, tell us about the idea. It's these vague, nebulous things. Awesome, right? Let's form an XP team and let's help you realize that idea in software. It is probably the best framework for vague initiatives. It really does shine in there. Emergent work, actually, it does fairly well, right? XP has while we still have the iteration bounds, XP does have a lot of flexibility in how the backlog is ordered. So it does all right handling emergent work. There are better, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not bad. Predictability and planning, not necessarily a strength. It's a little on the lower side. Yes, we can get a sense of pace, but you have to understand that XP time and pace is the least of its concerns, right? That is not its focal point. It is technical excellence and making sure we build the right thing, right? So can you get to some level of predictability? Yes. It is not the strongest one of the three in there, right? It's not its strength. Technical mastery and team ownership and discipline. If I could put that to 11 or 12 or 50, I would, right? XP is the framework for those pursuing technical excellence. Now, it's what it was built on, it's what you want to lean into. Cool. Right. So now that we kind of have our first one up there, right, we're going to, as we talk through the other frameworks, we're going to compare these as we go, right? So Kanban, I'm going to be able to go through this one a little bit faster. Right. So Kanban, it's older than XP. It's older than Scrum, right? It was born out of lean manufacturing. The easiest way to describe Kanban, it is the most flexible of all the frameworks. It has very, very, very few rules, right? In fact, it specifies very, very little about the events and ceremonies that you want to do, right? It does have guiding principles, however, that you need to follow, right? So it's not, the wild, wild west, but it does have a very much a choose your own adventure feel to it, right? Now, what's kind of cool about Kanban is like XP, you can see Kanban's influence in just about all the other agile frameworks, right? We see it to a degree in XP, we see it certainly in Scrum, we see it in the scaling frameworks, we see it utilized all over the place, right? And the reason for that is because of its ability to mold and adapt to a variety of situations and being a very visual flow-based management system, right? That's really what its hallmark is to develop a sense of unstoppable flow for any given process or situation, right? So, we see the visual boards come in, we see the concept of inspect and adapt and retrospectives come in. So while not agile from a traditional agile standpoint, when Kanban as a management system is paired with agile mindset and principles that we saw back then, right? If we focus on those things, but apply Kanban as a visual management system, it can be a powerful framework just on its own right, right? It has a lot of strengths to it, right? Now, Kanban in a nutshell, all right? Again, this is going to be pretty straightforward, right? Kanban is focused on one thing, which is visualize the work and make it flow better, right? It is all about flow, right? How do items move across the board? What's the most effective way to go from something to do to something that's to done, right? It is a pull-based system. In other words, it relies on the team to pull the work across the board to done versus pushing work into the team and overloading them, right? So it optimizes it from the team perspective of how do we make it easier, better, faster for them to pull work across the process. It starts out as a visual management system, right? So everything we do in Kanban is visualizing the work, right? Whether it's a whiteboard on a wall, a digital board in a system, or if you go to Starbucks and they have stations to make your coffee, right? They use Kanban. Your cup If you ever have Starbucks coffee, your coffee cup is a Kanban ticket. It's kind of cool. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Right? It visualizes the work. And the other thing Kanban does is sets very clear exit standards, right? So to move through any stage of the work on a board, right? I'll use the more complicated one. There is very specific criteria that have to be met for it to move from one stage to the other, right? So visualize the work, set very clear standards, right? Kanban is evolutionary versus revolutionary, right? So what do I mean by that? If you don't know where you want this to go, Kanban's your system, right? One of the primary rules of Kanban is do what you do today, just visualize it. You don't have to change a thing. We're just going to visualize the work that you're already doing, right? So if it's doing support, if it's managing a business process, for the first step, we change nothing. You don't have to learn anything new. All we need to do is figure out how to visualize it and have conversations, right? So from a revolutionary standpoint, we also have continuous a commitment to learning and relentless improvement, right? So those two go together, right? And what Kanban says is, as we visualize it, we're going to see stuff where it's bottlenecking. We're going to see stuff where it slows down. We're going to see stuff where it breaks. We're going to see inefficiency in the process, and we're going to change it, and we're going to measure it again, right? So it is, unlike learning a new framework, right? Kanban is very much incremental change driven by a sense of relentless improvement and inspection and adaptation, right? So, like I said, this Kanban molds to just about everything. Our Kanban has also empowered the worker, right? So one of the rules that absolutely is followed in Kanban is we work in small batches, right? We limit the amount of work in process, right? Because if we overload the system will stop. Right. So one of the first things that we start doing is learning how to shrink batches so they move through the system faster. Right. It is focused on finishing over starting. Right. So Kanban always works from done backwards. I don't care. Kanban doesn't care how many items you start. Started work has no value. Kanban focuses on done and what's finished, and then figures out how to pull that through the system as fast as possible. So we always start with the closest to done versus what we want to start in Kanban, right? We sort of ignore that until there's space for it, right? And we adapt from the pain that causes. It is highly flexible. It is extendable, right? It will work for a team of teams, business processes, right? It can go from the extremely simple, which is the top example there, doing done, to something that is more of a complex, multi-step, multi-board, multi-team thing down below. I have seen this scale from a single team all the way up to managing multiple teams in an organization in a single Kanban flow system, right? When I literally say very few rules and highly extendable, absolutely, right? Now, it does take some skill and understanding to get there, right? But it really is set up to handle it. Certainly some creativity and some understanding and rules involved, right? So as far as roles in Kanban, right here, it's easy. There are none. Team members. It doesn't change any roles. It actually, one of the rules of Kanban is respect existing roles. There are no delegated roles other than you are the team responsible for this flow of value. Right now, that being said, right, when we're talking about software development, there are some helpful things to have in place, right, that helps this run better, right, especially if we're in this like a software space or support space. Having some sort of business representation, whether you call that a product owner or some variation of it, having somebody that can help the team have a outside perspective for value and ordering, and understanding those needs and being able to weigh them, right? So whether that's a technical or domain leader that's prioritizing maybe a support board, or a business owner that's prioritizing a queue of enhancements, right? It is really, really helpful to have them part of a Kanban team, right? Not necessary, but helpful. As well as starting with an agile coach, right? Because of Kanban's highly flexible, highly configurable nature, it can be overwhelming the first time you do it. It can be overwhelming the first time a team is figuring out. And Kanban is one of those, because of its flexibility, it is very much a learn while you're doing type of framework. Absolutely, like we have classes and we will get in there and we teach, but often we'll recommend pairing some follow-up mentoring with the teams, because right, to teach Kanban properly, you have to lean into its flexibility, right? So a lot of times pairing, at least initially, for with a coach, to help the team understand, build out their system, and go through the first couple of rounds of inspect and adapt until they get it, is beneficial for them. And then we start getting into like customer stakeholders and customer feedback, right? With having some business voice on the team is helpful, right? So as far as events in Kanban, um, there's really two main ones. The rest are optional, right? So you can always add on and extend, right? But there's really two in Kanban that we look at, right? So the one is a backlog refresh, right? Because we're working in small batches, eventually we need to go back and get the next batch, right? And we need to get the next batch and the next batch. Now, this is not necessarily a cadence-based event, right? You can do that when the queue reaches 0, and whenever it reaches 0, go back and get the next batch of 10, batch of 20, right? Or if you wanted to take a look at it as a cadence event, right? Kanban's okay with that, right? So it's not specified as a cadence. If you want to do it weekly and that's what works for your team, awesome. If you want to do it when your queue gets down to the last one, whatever that time frame is, awesome. It just says you need a way on your team to go back and get the next batch, right? So weekly is common. You could also do it by count or number or depth in the queue. The other thing, though, that is really critically important in Kanban is Kaizen events, right? Kaizen, inspect and adapt, retrospective. It is not, again, a fixed cadence, but monthly is a common cadence for it, right? Doing it once a month, sometimes more frequently in the beginning. Right now, the interesting thing about Kaizen events, it is run by the team based on using some metrics and visually what's on the board and where things are stuck. The idea is to generate ideas from the team, empower the team to come up with a better way of doing it, right? This is where we're bottlenecking. This is where we're stuck. This is where handoffs aren't flowing. Do we need to reduce the amount of work? Do we need to expand the team? Like, what is it that you guys need to do? Right. And then we try it and we measure it. Right. And then we run another Kaizen event. Right. So to a degree, it's a lot like a retrospective. Kaizen traditionally has a couple of minor nuances. We're not going to go into it. But really empowering the team to look at the board, look at the workflow, and then figuring out a better way to do that. Right. So we may start a Kanban team essentially broken and visualize the work. And then we'll run Kaizen event, and Kaizen event, Kaizen event, and we'll get the team going from stuttering to some flow to flowing and delivering a stream of value over just a couple of cycles on that. Right. The other one that's on there that's not core, but it is helpful, is the daily boardwalk. Right. So it's run by the team like a stand-up, very similar to it, or a daily scrum. But the idea for Kanban is we read the board from done to to do. Right. So it also talks about emergent work or things that may come up and handle it. Right. As far as success factors, right, Kanban does need empowered team members. Right. They are the key to running it. They manage the work. They run the inspect and adapts. The team is responsible for changing the process. Right. As far as success, right, small batches. Right. Learning how to limit work is key for it, right? Kanban, when you overload it and you force it, it falls apart very, very quickly. So that's one of those key things that we don't violate. But here's the thing around it, though. There are no time boxes, right? So it really has to have a level of mastery around wanting continuous delivery, wanting continuous planning. But Kanban is also very urgent work friendly. It is one of the systems where part of the systems where they shine. It handles emergencies, gotchas, expedient emergent items almost better than all the other systems. It has a special, most Kanban boards will set up a special lane just to prioritize those through the system and pause the work to get the urgent and emergent off the table and then go back to our normally scheduled work. Right. So so when we do a comparison between one over the other, we kind of see in the top two, it's about the same as XP, or the top one's kind of about the same. Kanban, it's easier to master, right? It's easy to master because it's okay to make mistakes because you're going to learn from it. You're going to adjust the process, right? and there's only a handful of rules, right? So once you get the rules down in the pattern, and you start applying them and the team gets it, we're good to go, right? As far as easy to learn, because there are no rules and it's flexible, it takes a little bit of time to get used to it and get the team in the right mindset to do it, right? So its advantage of mastery is a disadvantage from learning. Vague initiatives, yeah, it does okay with it, right? XP does a little bit better because of the structure that's implied. Emergent work, right? Actually, I wanted to move that up a little bit higher. It's sort of like a 9.5. Kanban shines. If you've got stuff that is coming out of the woodwork left and right and need a system to manage chaos, Kanban is hard to beat, right? Predictability and planning, it does okay. Again, it's not a strength. You can get there with it. There are ways to do it, but they're not as inherent or implied as some of the other systems. Technical mastery doesn't care, right? It says you decide. It's not going there, right? So it's good to have, but it's not really a factor with it. But from a team ownership, right, while not at XP levels, right, if the team's not bought into using it, it's not going to work, right? So you do need team buy-in and investment that this is how we're going to run with it, right? So they got to be bought in, they got to want to do it, they have to own the framework to a degree. So it is a little bit higher up on that scale, right? So kind of getting into Scrum, right? So Scrum, right? Here's how I describe it, right? If Kanban and XP decided to have a baby, we'd have Scrum, right? It kind of is the middle of the road, and we see influences from both of these mixed in there, right? We also see that influence in the personality of Scrum that's in there, right? So Scrum in a nutshell, right? Scrum is a way to break down complex work into small increments. It uses frequent feedback to adapt the plan, right? So it has a plan, uses feedback to adapt the plan. So it is very empirical in how it approaches delivering the work. Scrum sets a clear heartbeat, right? It is cadence driven. It is synchronization driven. There is a pattern and a rhythm to it. There is a pattern inside the framework, and there is a pattern in the wrapper for the framework. Kanban or Scrum is revolutionary and evolutionary, right? So when I say it's revolutionary, you have to learn Scrum. Team has to learn how to do Scrum. The organization has to figure out how Scrum fits in with their delivery, right? So there is a revolutionary change element to it, right? However, Scrum is also evolutionary in that what they learn in the fundamentals is a starting point. What the organization learns in the fundamentals is a starting point, and it expects evolution over time to improve. Working delivery product is a focus early and often, right? Like XP, right? We see that influence come in there. We deliver small working increments at the end of every cycle, and relentless prioritization to remove waste, right? Those two things are hallmarks within Scrum. Get back to working, deliver an increment, ruthless, relentless prioritization, because they want to make sure we're working on the next best right thing, right? So it does have a balance to it, right? So it's build the right, there's a balance that's struck, right? Are we building the right thing? Are we building it the right way from a technical perspective? And then how do we improve how we build it, or can we shorten the feedback loop and build it faster, right? So there's really a balancing act that Scrum tries to strike, right? Where Kanban is flow and XP is technical, Scrum is balance, right? So kind of the unique pairing there, right? So roles, right? So this is the first one where we see a little more specialty roles, right? So inside of a Scrum team, we have a product owner, right? They are the voice of the customer, voice of the stakeholder. They own the order and priority in the backlog, right? They're there to maximize the amount of value delivered in the shortest amount of work, right? That's their job. It's a specialty role in the team. A team is not a Scrum team without one, right? A team needs a product owner. Right. The team has an embedded coach, which is the Scrum Master, right? They're there to help the team learn how to do this, learn how to improve this, and learn how to continue to get better at it, right? So they're figuring out how to do it better, faster, more effectively, more efficiently with the team, right? So we have two specialty roles that Scrum is needed to be successful, right? And they need a certain degree of mastery or to be good at it for a team to be successful. And then we have developers, right? So this is the group of people that are doing all the work. They are focused on delivering the product and planning the sprints and pulling the work into the sprints, right? And then last but not least, right, like XP, We do need customers and stakeholders for feedback and access and planning, right? Now, from a Scrum event perspective, like I said, this is also the most structured. All right, so how does the Scrum Master help? David, the Scrum Master really is, if you think of it like a sports team coach, right? If they hire a coach, the coach knows the big picture. What a good team looks like, how a good team runs offense, how a good team runs defense, what plays or what type of plays would help the team have a winning season. If you think of the Scrum Master as having that job, that responsibility in Scrum, it makes sense, right? The Scrum Master has the picture of what a good team looks like, how a good team operates, communicates, plans together, builds together, delivers, right? So that is their primary responsibility as far as Scrum is concerned, right? Lucky, I see your hand up. I'll get to you in a second, unless you have a question that's coming up. Then you can put that in the question section. As far as events, right? Scrum has a repeating time box, right? It goes from 4 weeks to 4 weeks to 4 weeks or less, right? It's a heartbeat, right? So it can be 1 week, 2 week, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. There, as long as it's fixed. There is inside of that sprint, that bigger wrapper, everybody runs a sprint planning event. It's the first event. It has its cadence. It runs on day one. This is where the how and the what are we building is discussed between the product owner and the team, right? And like XP, right, it does have a developer portion of it where they are breaking down those user stories or backlog items into the solution and the detailed tasks, right? Scrum kind of borrows that and says it's not good enough just to pull a story in. We also need the detail plan from the team in the sprint, right? So the sprint planning activity we see coming in there. It does have a daily Scrum, right? Very similar to the daily stand-up, right? But it's for the team, by the team every day to make sure they're hitting their goals, right? And then at the end, right, this is kind of where Scrum diverges from XP, is it says, let's connect stakeholder feedback, right? So at the end, when the team is done, we're going to get our stakeholder, our customer in the room, and we're going to say, hey, you asked for this. Let me show you this. This is what we built. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Do you want to change something? Right? So the planning activities in the beginning, very similar to XP. Scrum comes in at the end and says, nope, we got to connect the dots back at the end, right? Stakeholder, customer, ta-da, look what we built you. Is it awesome? Do you like it? Tell us what you think, right? And then Scrum closes out with their final thing in there, which is the retrospective, right? As a team, we did this last sprint. We've been doing a couple of sprints. What's the one thing we can do next sprint to make it better, right? So like Kanban and the Kaizen event, Scrum adds continuous learning and improvement to the cycle at the end, right? So it has this expectation that the team is going to evolve along the way, right? Now, when we look at that, right, really it's that balance, right? Are we building the right thing in the right way, and are we getting better at building it fast, right? So that leads into some success criterias, because Scrum does not hit some of this as heavy as say XP does, right? In fact, this is where we see a lot of these practices come in, right? So developer enablement and technical excellence is really one of the unspoken things. They talk about it in the Scrum Guide, they allude to it, they assume that it's there. But getting into dev enablement, right? Scrum will make you a little bit faster in the beginning. If you want real sustainable speed, you have to pair it with like XP or DevOps type principles, right? TDD, BDD, developer-owned excellence, frequent testing, DevOps, rapid deployment, shortening the feedback loop, right? Scrum will make you fast because it removes waste. It will, but DevOps and XP will keep you fast, right? So it's sort of unspoken, it's applied, but when it boils down to like what makes a team win and not win, this is one of those key factors that's in there, right? So they talk a lot about needing it, but they don't specify how to do it in the Scrum Guide and a lot of the trainings, right? When we get on the developer trainings, yes, but on the core, like on the surface marketing material, you don't see that, right? So in other words, you have to look into what it takes for the team to be excellent technically from a development standards, a product standards, right? You want a level of excellence, right? Don't assume, define it, right? And you have to pay attention to that with Scrum. Right. The other thing with Scrum is learning how to deliver a working increment, right? It's not just finishing a sprint. In Scrum, to be successful, getting really, really good at what the output of a sprint is, a working small product increment, is actually really, really key, right? Because if we never learn to master that, we get a lot of carryover work in Scrum of things just going from one sprint to the other, right? Which is usually a good opportunity to go back and relearn this fundamental. It's kind of a key fundamental with success with Scrum is getting to the state where the team understands what it means to have an increment at the end and what's involved in building that. And then good product ownership, oh my word, is critical to Scrum, right? Somebody who is on the business side that can do the prioritization, that is really good at removing and prioritizing low value work away from the team, really does help a Scrum team shine, right? It's that other key differentiating factor with Scrum, right? In fact, without that, most backlogs anyway have like up to 30% waste just sitting in there. A good product owner will avoid the team having that work and make sure the business understands why we're not doing it. Without that, the teams will just continue to chew on that waste time after time after time, right? So product ownership and aligning back to strategy and execution is a strength that Scrum teams need to lean into. Right now, kind of getting to our scorecard, just kind of as we close out here. Specific roles required. Yep. So Scrum has them, right? More than the other two. And they take a certain amount of knowledge, skill, and training to have them do it, right? Worth the investment, but it is a cost, upfront cost of making sure you have the roles on the team. As far as easy to master, right? It's interesting. Scrum kind of flips this a little bit. As far as learning, right? It's always been said, like Scrum doesn't have a lot of moving parts to it. Right. But how those parts assemble in the organization and what it means to master them, a little bit trickier, right? So it incurs a little bit more cost on the mastering side, but easier to learn. Vague initiatives, right? It does okay. Scrum does a little bit better with structured goals, right? It doesn't mean we need a perfect plan, but Scrum is really, really good at chewing down objectives, right? If we want to go do this in the product, right? Scrum is really, really good at breaking that down into segments and delivering the most valuable segments first, getting to working software, right? That's kind of the environment it was born and bred into, where vague initiatives can slow some of that down in Scrum. You can do it. Kanban and XP handle it a little bit better when there's vague. Emergent work, because of the heartbeat, the time box, right? It handles some degree of emergent work, right? As long as it can fit into the sprint planning cycle, it does okay, right? So it's not horrible, but if it is stuff coming out every day, every other day, changing, shifting priorities, that is not a strength of Scrum, right? Scrum very much is a heartbeat, working around the heartbeat type of framework. However, what we do get is a benefit around the predictability and planning, right? If you have this dialed in, Scrum is really, really good at predictability and doing projection, right? So emergent work, weakness, however, predictability, strength, right? Technical mastery, right? So yes, but you also have to have the organization engage on it, right? It is not native out of the gate, right? XP hits you over the head with it. Technical mastery, technical mastery, technical mastery. Scrum says, yeah, you want it, right? Now, what Scrum really means is do it, right? They're not as heavy-handed with XP, so it kind of gets lost, right? So you got to want it, do it, define it. It really does help the teams, right? And then team ownership, in the beginning, not quite as much. However, for long-term success, maybe I would slide that a little bit to the right, right? So what you do see is like what we saw in the beginning is Scrum is a little more balanced from that perspective, right? Right. So it's interesting, right? So how does this fit in with organizations, right? So I'll let you guys read ahead on that, right? But these are not absolute, right? I have had Kanban teams do new feature development. I have had XP teams also handle support in their XP process, right? It's okay, right? They really can play across the lines. But we do see certain types of activities leaning better into some other things, right? Like XP, R&D initiatives. When you need to find the solution and it's not clearly defined. When you have customer contracts and customization work and the customer's involved. When you absolutely hands down want quality as your front runner more than anything else, XP is your guide, it's your framework, right? And it works better with smaller teams, right? XP, while you can scale it up, it takes some additional stuff that outside of XP. So it's really good in like the 1, 2, 3 team sweet spot, right? Kanban, right? anything that's flow based, right? So support tickets, service tickets, business processes, really do really well in Kanban. That flow based system and visualization, it's almost like it was made for it. Hint, hint. But also it does good with like business process, portfolio tracking, product management type activities. If you're doing some sort of like DevOps enablement or roadmap enablement work, Kanban does really well, right? Now, also, if you have an existing product that has periodic enhancements, that's just like a flow of continually enhancing the product. Kanban actually does really well with that product enhancement or maintaining a current product. It holds its own there very well. And again, I have had teams do full-born parallel teams running Kanban for software development in a team environment alongside Scrum teams and do it, right? The difference is they weren't new to Kanban, right? They really were really good at it. They mastered it, they owned it, and they were able to hang with the team, right? And then we see the Scrum ones, which we kind of just talked through, so I'm not going to repeat those. Right, and at the end of the day, right, there is some back and forth, right? You can borrow elements, you can let it influence it, right? And right, it really is, what's going to fit and work for the team. Common frameworks like Scrumban, or are there others? Yeah, so I'm only going to be able to go into that a little bit. So asked the question, please comment on hybrid frameworks like Scrumban, and are there others? Yeah. So a lot of times we will see some hybrids. I'm not going to be able to go deep on it here, right? Where you get Scrumban, right? So where there is a time box, but it's a little more flow oriented. There's less focus on some of the events and the ceremonies, but it focuses more on managing the work in process at the team level, right? So you start to see some hybridization come in. Scrum XP, right, was a popular one in the beginning, where Scrum was the outside framework, but XP and the planning game and the technical excellence was at the team level, right? And TBB was a front runner, and they focused in on the planning game, and they focused more on the technical ownership, and they more shared the Scrum roles as a team member versus than delegating them out, right? So we still see those hybrids out there. My general approach on them is there's good in them, but learn how to get really good at one of the other ones before you decide if that's something you want to do. That's my personal take on it. I think if you get really good at one of them and you understand how it's used, then you can figure out how to tinker with some of the other ones, right? Our teams are contracted with specific start and end dates. Do you have a recommendation framework for a situation with hard deadlines? It seems like it might be Scrum. Yes, I would agree with that, right? So the question was hard dates and start and end dates. If you have start and end dates and you have a commitment that you need to manage down to that, it is Scrum, right? And the reason for that is Scrum will absolutely, you can hit those dates, you can break that up into time frame and have the team to apart it. The success to that is you've got to manage scope. You always have to know what's the pace of my team. They have to have a degree of technical excellence so you can always get to a working build. And if you're managing scope, right, you are always figuring out what's in, what's out, and making sure you're prioritizing up to it, right? That's how you win that game. Scrum is the way to go, right? If you need to know more about that, let's connect afterwards, right? So really what this boils down to is the myth of one, right? We see a lot of organizations like, oh, we want to do Agile, let's adopt Scrum, right? The reality is organizations, good Agile organizations, healthy Agile organizations, right? That's more of a myth, right? What we tend to see is organizations maybe with a handful of XP teams running R&D initiatives or special projects inside the house. We may see a bunch of Kanban teams either running product maintenance, product support, or managing business flow, right? We see more variability in there because the organization starts to learn that Agile isn't a singular thing. Agile is in all of these frameworks and processes, and we should use the right one that fits the job and fits the team, right? It becomes a little more situational. Right. So in closing, I know I'm a little bit over time. Right. What about scaling? Right. So here's what we'll need to know. Right. Give us feedback if you want something like this on scaling. Right. We can get into this very similar thing between Safe, Less, and Scrum at Scale, and even Nexus to a degree, although not as common as it used to be. Right. But right. Here's what I want to say on scaling. Right. any of the scaling frameworks, if that's an area that you're considering, right? This is kind of the specialty, the world that I like to live in is scaling up. All of the scaling frameworks, every single one of them will tell you you have to have really good execution at the team level first, right? Before you even consider doing it, you have to have healthy teams running healthy Scrum, XP, or Kanban, whatever framework it is that you're using, right? And the reason for that is scaling is not going to fix that, right? You can't scale crappy code, practices, process, or anything else, right? One of the other frameworks says, right, whenever you do that, right, whenever you scale up bad stuff, right, you get, whenever you scale up Agile, you get the good, yeah. You also get the bad and the ugly. And depending on how much of it you have, you're going to get more of it and you're going to get it all at once, right? So, that's when I went down this route. I'm like, all right, let's talk about the root, the foundation first before getting into scale, because, right, we want to have a healthy appreciation of what makes that successful. And then we can talk about the scaling topics, right? So if you want a second one on scaling, social media, website, give comments or feedback here in chat. We'll take that away and we'll set that up, right? Last but not least, right? Just an invitation to continue the conversation. From a Clearly Agile's perspective, right? We're part of the Agile community and we are here to help. Right. We sell services, we do coaching, consulting, training, mentoring, workshops. But at the end of the day, right, we're here to help. We're part of the Agile community. That's part of what Agile is being about, right? So connect with us on social media. Right, we got a few guys on our team that run some really awesome like Agile podcast learning events. We do the webinars here. We run Lean Beer, Lean Coffee if you're in the Tampa area. Right. We want to connect, right? We want to be part of the community and help you be part of that conversation. If you're looking for something else, services, you need a Scrum Master, a product owner, or even an entire Agile team who's already awesome, we can do that for you. If you're looking for coaching and coaching services, we can do that for you, right? And we're going to approach that from a boutique consultancy standpoint, not just selling you services. That's one of the foundations that we believe in. Is we want it to be effective and valuable for you, right? It's all about making you better, not just, a sales relationship, right? So feel free to connect on social media, reach out on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. And actually, there was something about a prize, right? So I know something about picking a name and spinning a wheel, but that's about as far as I remember.
Yes. So this afternoon, I will do a drawing for everyone that registered for the webinar. The winner will win a $25 Amazon gift card, which will also be emailed out to you this afternoon if you were the winner. And it also included in that email will be a video or a link to our YouTube, which will have the video of this webinar if you'd like to review or send to someone else, as well as some other links. And we'll also keep you updated on May's webinar. We haven't had it nailed down scheduled just yet, but we will let you know the topic and our presenter here shortly.
Topics were floating right before this call, actually.
Yep, exactly.
It's a mystery. It's a mystery to us too. It'll be good. All right, awesome. Well, thank you very, very much. Like I said, we'd love to connect, and hopefully we'll see you next month if we don't talk to you sooner.
Thank you.
Thank you.